Hey guys, Kid here of Burnwell with the Shadowverse Evolved channel, bringing you another deck profile, this time on Reina Heal Havencraft. This is actually a deck list that was crafted within my play group. We were actually going to use this deck at the Houston Regional, but leading up to the event, we had one big issue with the deck was that the only matchups that were so unbearable were Dragoncraft and sometimes Forestcraft, depending on how they play out, but every other matchup was very favored for this deck, and so we wanted to take this there because we felt like it was the strongest deck there. But the issue being Dragoncraft being such a popular craft running around at the regionals and performing very well, which means that there was probably going to be at least minimum a quarter of the room on Dragoncraft because of how consistently good it is. And so we ended up deciding not to play this list at Houston. With the recent announcement of Shenlong being restricted to one starting in, I believe, December 9th, this deck should perform very well into what's left in the meta. There might be some changes you have to make. When we originally made this list, we mostly focused on the idea of playing this at Houston, and because Dragon was still available at the time as an option for players to be playing because of Shenlong, we decided to make some changes to this list, particularly to be hopefully balance our matchup against Dragoncraft. So going into the future, there are probably changes you might want to make, but I figured we'll do an in-depth discussion on this deck when I do the breakdown here and talk more about it. This is probably going to be a little bit longer than our normal deck profiles, so sit back and enjoy this one if you're a Havencraft player. All right, so first things first is I'm going to get into the deck itself, and then we'll kind of explore beyond that once I go through everything. So obviously we have Bellring Angel as a 3-of, one of the Evo. We already know it's really good at slowing down matchups and also kind of curving aggro matchups to like slow them down that way. Present Priestess, we need this because our deck revolves around a specific amulet, which is Elena's Prayer, so we are searching for that, as well as we can find Sacred Plea to help with our draw power when we need it. 3-of, obviously, because it's such a good card. We play 2 of the Evo because generally we want to Evo at any time we get this card, and surprisingly in this deck you can Evo it 3 times if you need to, even though we only have 2 Evos. 2 Sacred Plea, we need some kind of draw power in this list. It was one of the big issues initially when we were designing this list, and we ended up coming down to 2 Sacred Pleas into the list. It really helps you keep your gas up, especially later in the game. Black Inscripture, very good card early game, good into Dragon because it removes their Ayala if they play that card, as well as against Sword. This is one of the outs to them playing Leonidas and like trying to crash it in or leaving it there with only 2 health left. This is how we get rid of it a lot of the times. Surefire Bullet, there's a lot of good evos that become a 4/4 or at our 4 health or so, and then also there's still a lot of other cards we want to remove that are at 3 health, so this card is just a very optimal, very powerful 2-cost removal. 3-of Priestess of the Cudgel, so we want to have some early aggression and like 2-for-1s basically. And Priestess of the Cudgel like facilitates that while letting us to Evo earlier on to build up to our Reina turns. So the deck is basically built around Elena's Prayer. This is the card that kind of like pushes this deck from being like mediocre to, oh, we have a very strong like mid-range tempo going on once we start hitting the 5 and higher play points. Archangel Reina is kind of the key piece to the deck because we found that there was a lot of issues going on early on where we're tapping out but not being able to respond to our opponent doing things on their turn, and with Elena Prayer in the deck, being able to Acolytes light something on our opponent's turn lets us boost up our own cards during our opponent's turn and then come back to us and we can boost them up again. So we're getting kind of like a 1-2-3 punch there, going from our turn, buffing everything with Elena's Prayer, going to their turn, buffing everything on their turn, then coming back to our turn, buffing them again to swing in for huge amounts of damage. Elena's Prayer, we play 2, it's not Elena's Prayer, Archangel Reina, we play 2 of the Evo because this lets us have all 3 of our Archangel Reinas being active at all points in the game, because once we Evo 1 and it gets removed, the second one reflips over the other one, so we can get it again every single time. So each Each Reina is going to be able to evo throughout the game and lets us recycle more and more of our play points. Though usually after the first or second one, we're probably not going to get much play points after the second one usually. But usually the first one is the most impactful one, especially if you were able to get a lot of evos off early on. And then the second one usually kind of balances out where it comes down to like this being a 2-cost card. Obviously, for those that aren't aware, on Evolve, you recover X play points where X equals the number of face-up followers in your Evolve deck. Then you turn them face down, so basically refreshes your Evo deck, which is really powerful. And the fact that you get these play points back lets us do really silly plays, especially later in the game when we want to do something that costs more than 10 play points, or if we want to like play this down, do something else, and then leave up play points to be able to counter something on our opponent's turn. We play 3 Jeanne d'Arc. We still have issues with the, aggro matchup, and this is very good into sword as well. We only play 1 of the Evo. As we play the deck more and more, we realize that we don't really ever need more than 1 Jeanne Evo. Sometimes it would be nice to have 2, but with how the deck works, we can really realistically only play 1. And usually when we Jeanne Evo, we don't need the Evo again for quite a while. So this is still like active once we drop our Reina turn and flip it back over. So we can usually get 2 Jeanne Evos off in a game if needed. Radiance Angel, 4-drop 3/4 ward, comes into play, draws a card, helps with our consistency as well as slowing down some of the aggro matchups. But what makes this card so good for us is we play 1 of the Evo, it heals on Evo. So on games where we curve like Elena on 3 into Radiance Angel on 4 with an Evo point, we can immediately evolve it. Making this a 5/6. It's basically build your own Shenlong at that point, and then from that point we can build it up more and more until it can usually swing in for a lot of damage if we want, or we can immediately engage it, making it really hard for our opponent to deal with. Next, Alkalight's Light, we play it as a 3 of. We opt for this as a 3 of obviously because 1, it banishes, which means against certain decks like Dragon or even Abyss, they can't like recycle cards from their cemetery or get up to that cemetery count for Necrocharge. This heals, so on our opponent's turn it procs the heal for our leader, which means that Elena's Prayer procs as well because it says once per turn, but not only during your turn. So since it's once per turn on either player's turn, this will proc on your opponent's turn offensively as well. So you can make plays where they'll try to like crash into something thinking they're going to be powerful enough to remove it. You can Alkalight's Light something else away before it attacks and then cause them crash into your follower and then losing their follower and not removing the follower they thought they were going to remove, which was really powerful in my opinion. We play 2 executions because let's be honest, Leonidas is running around. We need extra ways to answer big things, big threats, and amulets our opponents drop. It's pretty decent in the mirror match for Haven because sometimes players will play down their Sacred Pleas but not crack them immediately, and a lot of times we get good value by using execution just to remove their Sacred Plea because they don't always have a lot of followers for us to deal with on the board because if they're playing Aegis Haven, they're pretty follower light for the most part, especially ones that are threatening to us. There's not a lot of really threatening followers until they get to the Aegis turn. Dark Angel Olivia, this is one of like the reasons I really like this deck. So this card, a lot of times the modes you're going to be picking is either heal 3 and draw a card or heal 3 and make our opponent discard a card. If you ever get to the point where you can heal 3 and force your opponent to discard a card because it's more value than you drawing a card, you've probably already won the match. The fact that this is a 5/5 is really good because in the Dragon matchup, for example, 5 health is usually the factor at which they can trade 1-to-1 usually. But if you go to 6 health or higher, they are usually forced to use like a follower plus a spell or something like that to get rid of Dark Angel Olivia once we have Elena's Prayer out on the board. Obviously that this card procs Elena's Prayer by itself is really big. So if Elena's Prayer is already on the board, this is every time you play this card, it's basically a 5-drop 6/6 that either forces our opponent to discard a card, we draw a card, or we get an Evo point. You don't get the Evo point too often, but there are situations where it can come up where you can make cute plays with the Evo point, though they hardly ever come up, but it's something to think about when playing this deck. Finally, we play a 3 of Kaguya with only 1 of the Evo version here because we do flip it back. Once again, this is another card just like Olivia. So When you get to 5 play points or so, we can use Kaguya to cheat out Elena's Prayer through its fanfare ability here. When it comes into play, you select an amulet that costs 3 play points or less in your hand and put it to the field. And then whenever this amulet comes into play, or whenever an amulet comes into play, you can deal you select an enemy follower on the field and deal X damage to it, where X equals the amulet's cost. So what's really good about this is that, once again, this is like another 2-for-1 situation where we're gonna cheat something out. So normally that like be able to play a 5-drop plus Elena's Prayer is at 8 play points, but we get to cheat Elena's Prayer out, which is really good for us, as well as remove something usually when Elena's Prayer hit the board. If we're able to Evo on 6 or on 7, we go into this, which also summons another amulet, making this card quote unquote invincible for the turn because it can't take damage during your turn while that amulet's on the board. And then it heals your leader for 3, which means not only are we, getting out of lethal range once again, we're also buffing our board. So this becomes a 6/6, and it can basically remove most things in the game at that point. And when you can like 2-for-1 once again, or even 3-for-1 in some cases, because you'll do plays like Kaguya, play Elena's Prayer, Evo, summon another amulet from this, the Ephemeral Moon, which does another 3 damage somewhere you want. And then this now has Rush, and it's a 6/6 and doesn't take damage during your turn. So you can swing this into something. And now your opponent has a really annoying board they have to deal with immediately. And it's really rough for people to even like handle those boards once Kaguya gets going, and if they don't have immediate answer during their turn. Finally, we play a One of Lucifer. I like this One of Lucifer. Some of my play partners didn't like it. I enjoyed it because it usually bought us extra turns in the Discard Dragon matchup, but also playing this on 7 or in combination with Archangel Reina is really busted, because we set up scenarios where we don't have to engage this. We just heal 4 immediately at the end of our opponent's turn, buffing this up, and we can just get a free proc every turn essentially to buff up our board over and over and over again, while also healing us out of lethal range once again, which is really, really good. We do not play the Evo though. We didn't have really room for it, and the timing of the Evo when it comes in is just not that great for us, honestly, and we would rather have the heal instead of the burn 4. Though if you can find a way to fit it in and play it and you think it's good, just go for it, I think. So let me talk a little bit about the whole deck's game plan, essentially what makes this deck so good. So by looking at this, we pressure our opponent a lot more than normal Haven lists, because once we get the Elena's Prayer on board, we can start building up small boards that suddenly get bigger and bigger and bigger through all our like active healing that we do throughout with some of our 5-drops and 4-drops and so forth. So games can very much snowball if your opponent doesn't have an answer immediately. Sometimes you only have to have 2 threats on the board to really like threaten your opponent's like entire life total, because of how much healing and also buffing this deck does. A lot of times you're going to find yourself just playing like a Kaguya down along with like a Dark Angel Olivia, or even just playing Kaguya with a Radiance Angel, or Kaguya with Jean, or Kaguya with Priestess of the Cudgel. And as long as you have Elena's Prayer on the board, your cards start getting bigger and bigger and bigger till the point your opponent can't really handle them, because a lot of removals just do either damage, usually maxing out at 5. Otherwise, they're going to have to use their executions on their followers. And if they make the mistake of not, taking care of Elena's Prayer early on, usually after like one or 2 turns of Elena's Prayer being on the board, that's enough for your followers to become too threatening that they have to prioritize removing your followers instead of Elena's Prayer, which means every turn you can just keep building up over and over and over again with the Elena's Prayer proccing every turn, which is really threatening. What makes it so good too is the fact that usually I'm going to use Dark Angel Olivia here for an example. 5 health on a follower is like the breaking point between it being able to be removed by like one thing against Dragon and a lot of other spells like Unbridled Fury and things like that. So once you hit that 6 or higher health point, these cards become infinitely harder to remove without just using something like Execution or Acolyte's Light just to remove it, something that doesn't look at doing damage. Because of that, like followers once again like Dark Angel Olivia and Kaguya, once evoed, are huge like boss monsters essentially that are really hard to deal with, including Archangel Reina herself. She's a 5/6, which means she's still like kind of rough for your opponent to deal with, especially if you don't have to trade her into anything or remove something when you evo her. And if you're able to play her with Elena out, Evo, get some play points back, and then heal again in that same turn, this becomes a 6/7, which is pretty big, pretty scary. And if you don't have to engage it too, which is the scary part, because sometimes your opponent like doesn't have a way to really deal with that until like it becomes engaged, so they can start swinging into it to remove it. And so it's incredibly very scary during the mid game once stuff starts building up. So the general game plan for this deck overall is, I mean, if it's not too obvious already, we're looking to have some early game stabilization through Bellringer Angel, Prism Priestess trading into something while also finding one of our key cards, Elena's Prayer. If we already have Elena's Prayer, we're going to grab Sacred Plea just to get more card advantage early on, so we can, our 1-for-1s with our spells and amulets and stuff, you know, feel good. Besides that, we're just looking for 2-for-1s whenever we can. So Priestess of the Cudgel is like a very powerful card. Jeanne d'Arc is very good because we want to get to that point where we're about the mid game around, you know, 6 or 7 play points is when we kind of completely stabilize and become a really huge threat, and usually can end the game within 1 to 2 turns after that if our opponent doesn't have a very good way to clear the board completely. A lot of times when our opponent does have to clear the board that way, they end up spending a lot of their resources, and after that, if you just build a little bit again after that, they usually fall apart from there because they can't really deal with the board anymore. Ideally, we're looking to curve into Elena's Prayer on 3 or cheat it out with Kaguya. Those are like the key moments you want to be able to play Elena's Prayer. Once you've developed Elena's Prayer, I think the game becomes infinitely hard if they don't deal with Elena's Prayer immediately with an execution, because they won't realize how quick the power of your followers just gets out of control, which is insane. One thing to note with this list too is that sometimes you have to make decisions on evoing even if you get no value out of it at all, because you already have an Archangel Reina in your hand, so that when you get to that turn 5 or turn 6 or turn 7 and you Archangel Reina and evo to get those play points back, you need to have followers already evolved. So, you know, if you have nothing better to do, say you're playing it in a mirror match, you play Bellringer Angel, they don't remove it, you know, like it's either going to get banished, you're going to run into something later, you might as well evo the Bellringer Angel so that it becomes a play point you can use later. It's kind of like, you know, spending your early evo points and your early play points that you weren't going to use anyway on an evo to prep your big mid-game burst damage turns with Archangel Reina. So a lot of common plays you can do with Archangel Reina, which I think is like the really busted part of this, is once you have Elena's Prayer out, you can do really silly things like you can drop Archangel Reina, evo, flip over some play points, and then drop a Dark Angel Olivia to make them discard and heal 3. And suddenly your board is insane. You have like what is it? A 6/7 and a 6/6 on board that your opponent has to immediately deal with next turn. Otherwise, they're going to take a bunch of damage. There are plays where you can, I've done before against Dragon, which has been really funny, which is Archangel Reina. I think we're on like turn 7 actually, and I already had 5 evos out on my evo deck. Archangel Reina evo, so it basically becomes a free because it costs only 1 to evo, so total play points is 5 into the Archangel Reina evo. And then we just drop Lucifer behind it and just pass turn, heal 4, buff them up. And now your opponent has a board they have to deal with immediately, which is incredibly scary. Like I said earlier too, if you go second in this deck, if you go second and you're able to present Elena's Prayer on 3, going into a Radiance Angel on 4, using an evo point to evo to heal 2 and buff this up to a 5/6 and draw a card is really powerful. And once again, you don't have to engage it immediately. Unless you're threatened by like Fortes or something like that, or you think you're gonna like take too much damage next turn. The fact that you can do stuff like that is really absurd in my opinion. One other thing that made Archangel Reina very powerful for this deck, I think I talked about it a little bit earlier, but I'm just gonna say it again, is that one of the big issues I found when playing this deck before without Archangel Reina was that we would have these really good burst turns of building a board of like 6/6s and things like that, and like healing up and removing things. But the issue is we were tapped out all the time because we were like pushing to have a very threatening board, while not being able to play any of the control elements of our deck because we have 3 Surefire Bullets, 2 Blackened Scriptures, 3 Acolytes Lights, 2 Executions, all cards we want to use to remove things on our opponent's turn because they're all quick play spells, right? And so the way we kind of mitigated that was Archangel Reina. So turns where you can't make big swing plays with Archangel Reina, what you can still do is like drop down Archangel Reina, Evo it, have a 5/6 on the board, and now you have the play points available to you to be able to respond to your opponent attacking into you or doing anything like that at the end of their turn, instead of having to like kind of sit there, build a board and like wait for your opponent to like do something to you afterwards because you have no responses. One of the big strengths to me for Haven is that you have a lot of really good quick spells to respond and remove things and remove threats. Things like Acolyte's Light that don't really look at followers' health or anything like that is just a really good answer to anything big and scary, things like Bahamut and so forth. So like if your opponent plays something big and scary and Archangel Reina now gave you the points back to respond to it after also creating a threat on your board, that seems very oppressive to me. And I think a lot of people, when it happens to them, they're like, crap, like I can't really do much because they just refunded like 4 to 5 play points, and now Archangel or Acolyte's Light is now active again, Execution is active again, Surefire Bullet, Blackened Scripture, things they didn't necessarily have to worry about if you're playing like a 5-drop follower on turn 5 and then flipping over like 4 followers it's huge, and 4 Evo followers is huge in my opinion. That's kind of the general game plan here. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Evo deck. Because we're playing Archangel Reina, we have to kind of skew our Evo deck in a weird way. So this is what I came up with. You can obviously, change it to your liking. Bellringer Angel as a 1 of Evo is always going to be good. So we obviously have that. It's a low cost Evo that will happen early game. Same thing with Prison Priestess. We play this as a 2 of though, because if we get later in the game and we still haven't seen Reina to flip our Evo deck over, it's really good to have the second Evo available to you, especially if we happen to draw into both of these or like 2 Prison Priestess early on. Having the Evo is very important. So having this at 2, in my opinion, was very, very big. Next, Priest of the Cudgel, we had this as 2 as well. This is another card that I felt like, unlike all the other cards that we have in our deck that only have 1 Evo, at least they all do something themselves. But Priest of the Cudgel is another card where it's very good to Evo early, and multiple early is really good to Evo, but also the base form of the card doesn't do anything. So we want to be able to at least Evo it twice, before Archangel Reina comes out, if it's like a late draw into our Reina. That way, these 2 cards, Priest of the Cudgel and Prism of the Priestess, are 2 big Evo cards that we want to be able to Evo their base form whenever we draw into it, and not have to be locked into like trying to find a Reina and stuff like that. Another thing too, which is really good, keeping these as 2 ofs instead of just 1 ofs in the Evo deck. There are times where you'll just Evo Priestess of the Cudgel because in the matchup, it is not a very good like follower that all the time. There's no good targets for it, especially against Dragon. A lot of times, if they're playing like Ramp Dragon instead of Discard Dragon, you won't have very good things to like target with the on evolve effect. So just getting a 4/4 out on the board and like being like, here's a 4/4, deal with it. And if you do deal with it later on, you're not going to see it, but Reina is going to come down, flip it back over, and just give me play points for doing that, which is very good in my opinion. Kaguya as a 1 of, I know some lists who do run Kaguya, they just play it as like a 2 of or so. What's nice about this is Kaguya is such a late game like Evo thing that's going on. So there are games where you can Kaguya Evo, and then the following turn we're going to Archangel Reina and flip it back over. So you generally get 2 Kaguya Evos a game anyway. Same thing with Jeanne d'Arc, like I said earlier. From testing, it felt very much like we didn't need Themis anymore. Jeanne d'Arc only really needs to Evo once early on, and then we could flip it over later in the game and then play it in Evo again late into the game to clear boards and then, pump everyone's health back up, which is really good. So it didn't feel like we needed 2 in the list. I mean, sometimes it would be good to have 2 in some scenarios, but we kind of make some sacrifices to be able to play the Archangel Reina, which I think is one of the key components of the list. If it wasn't for Elena's Prayer and Archangel Reina, I think the list would look completely different, and especially the Evo deck. Radiance Angel, now this is a card that unfortunately, as much as I would love to have 2 before having the Reina turns go off and stuff like that, we're kind of locked into only being able to play 1. because at least the base form, worst case scenario, is still a draw card. But usually, a lot of times you can get the draw card, the heal, and then flip it over. So you get about 2 of them anyway. And a lot of decks already only kind of run 2 Radiance Angel Evos. And sometimes you can get 3 depending on how the matchup goes. Because like I said, you can get a lot of Reinas to flip over and over again, because we can recycle our Evos as often as we want. Because like I said, having 2 Reina Evos in the deck flips one back over every time you Evo the other one once it gets removed, which means you quote unquote go infinite with Archangel Reina, or essentially you're playing 3 Reinas in your Evo deck, even though you're playing 2, if that makes sense at all. I'm sure there's going to be some questions about the list itself, because I know this is a very unconventional list, because I don't think there have been many lists trying to run Reina, and especially Elena's Prayer in combination with these two. So feel free to ask questions below. You can talk about matchups and things like that. Personally, from our testing, I felt like the only bad matchups this deck really had was Dragon. And once Shenlong is gone, Dragon's going to be around less and be less consistent, which means I think this deck is going to get stronger. This deck had a very strong matchup into Sword already, in my opinion, which means that Sword becoming better means that this list could do very well into the new meta after Shenlong is gone. And the only other matchup which isn't getting played a lot, and I didn't get a lot of testing into it as much as I wanted to figure out how bad the matchup is. Forestcraft, you know, if it high rolls and you just take a ton of damage, and the burst damage is just too much for you sometimes through the Rose Queen combos, and I forget the 7-drop, but the 7-drop burn spell as well is very scary running into this, because even though we do heal a lot, taking huge burst damages of like 9 or like 10 or something is very hard for us to like recover, because it takes multiple turns to get out of that range once again of lethal if our opponent's like playing the burn spell game basically. So to me, those were the only 2 bad matchups. And like before, this is free. When you get free farming into Runecraft, usually I think both versions of Runecraft lose his deck very hard. The only time like something like D-Shift would beat you outright is if for some reason you go through like half your deck and you aren't able to get like 2 4-drop removal spells, because generally how you beat out D-Shift is once you get to hit 8 play points, you essentially just pass the turn over and over again, because the D-Shift player has drawn through so much of their deck. And if you always have 2 hard removal up, a lot of the times the D-Shift player cannot deal with that if they want to, you know, play D-Shift and their big guys out on a turn like that. And usually if you're able to like, you know, have somewhat of a board on there and it can heal a little bit over and over again, it gets pretty hard for D-Shift players to deal with it. And then they deck themselves out a lot of the times, or like they lose all their threats and they can't really close out the game. And then I think Runecraft being dirt, unless they curve out like incredibly well, and even then I feel like it's not that favored or at all in them. You kind of just outdo what they're trying to do essentially, because once you start getting to the Reina, Dark Angel, Olivia turns with Elena's Prayer on the board, your board just gets too much for them to handle. There are situations maybe you do get kind of burned out if you're not careful, but usually having Acolyte's Light, executions and things like that just is not an issue for you. You can remove any of the problem cards those opponents have. One thing to note here, I know people might look at this list and see no D-Shift is kind of insane. Through our testing, we felt D-Shift wasn't as needed. I could see a version of this deck running D-Shift, or not D-Shift. Did I say D-Shift? I'm so sorry. I mean Themis. We can run some number of Themis, but after playing this so much, it felt like Themis was just a dead card like 90% of the time. The only time it was like kind of good was like we need to reset the board, and even then that didn't feel super good a lot of times, because if we were resetting the board, we were probably losing the game anyway at that point, because we're such a follower based deck now. The pressure from this too, for the Haven matchup when we were playing against Aegis, since we get to build followers on the board that are very threatening, we forced the Aegis player a lot of times to like have to clear the board themselves, and if they don't, we're just swinging in. Suddenly we're swinging in for like 6s and 7s or even higher than that, depending on how we develop the board with Archangel Reina and Elena's Prayer on the board, meaning that they can't necessarily like skip a turn to play Seraph. They can't skip a turn without warding up an Aegis and evoing it. And even then, through our healing through those matchups because it's just control based and they're not threatening our life total too much early on at all. We usually heal up to the point where we're like hitting like 30 life total or more, which means we can take a couple hits from Aegis. So we can wait a turn and like force them to like go through a ward or something, and then have Aegis swing into us. We can take like 10 or 12 damage and not really care. And then on the return swing, we have such huge followers that we can clear their Aegis and still kind of swing in for some amount of damage a lot of the time, especially if we're doing something like leaving our big guys out, using like something like Radiance Angel or whatever to Evo, swing in, buff our board, and swing in with something else, and then swing in with another like 6 or 7 power follower that got buffed up through Elena's Prayer. It's very insane. If you're looking at something different to try with Haven, I highly recommend this list. It's a lot of fun. At least I think it's more fun than playing Control Aegis, even though I really like Control Aegis. It's the deck I had the most success on. But anyway, I'm going to kind of wrap this up here. There are some shout outs here. So this deck idea itself was not necessarily forged by my own. It was with my playgroup. The main people that helped build this was Skaz. Skaz came up with the initial outline before we added Reina and stuff. He was looking at Elena's Prayer and like the life total things like that for Dark Angel Olivia and Kaguya, seeing that it kind of gets out of range of Dragon being able to handle. So that's how this kind of got started, and we worked together to build this list up more and more. Another person that was part of putting in a lot of their input on how the list runs and whether they felt it was good or not was Prescia. So shout out to those two. And then myself, obviously, we put so much work into this list. It was kind of sad that we decided at the end that it was not good enough to like compete against all the dragons we anticipated. Looking back at the tournament now in Houston, if we had the option to swap decks back to this, I think we would have. I think we would have had a very much better game moving forward in Swiss and as well as in the top 8. If we were able to play this list instead. But things happen. At the end we decided to go with kind of our ramp dragon control list because it just felt like it had a better spread of matchups. And unfortunately, we both kind of basically bubbled out of the events. We both went 3-3 and couldn't close it out with those decks. But I'm sure there's a timeline out there where we took this list in and maybe both won it all. It would have been crazy. But once again, if you're looking at something different to play with Haven, I highly recommend this list. I'm going to include the deck link below in the more information section on YouTube. So if you want to take a closer look there, you can. Other than that, we hope to see you guys in our next video. Later, everyone.